going to get started. This is Lee Larson. She has preached for me a few times, so you may recognize her and remember her. She is going through the process to become ordained, and with this being Women's History Month, wanted to present on various women, Christian women throughout history. So thank you for being here.
Howdy folks, my name is Lee Larson. Thank you so much for spending about 45 minutes of your Sunday with me. I promise we'll get straight to the point. A few housekeeping things. I guess the last time I saw y'all was January. I've been out of town quite a bit. I wrote children's books based on my dog narrating national parks to kids. And never in my wildest dreams did I think that those would become political books. But in the last few months, of course, it's been very highly politicized, our national park. So, weird thing. But tomorrow, if you like what I have to say, tomorrow at 5 p.m. at the public library, I am speaking on secular democracy, religious pluralism, and women's rights. Again, at the library tomorrow at 5. It's for a paper I wrote for the Disciples of Christ Journal. It's called the Stone Campbell Journal, and it's a finalist for our conference next month in Knoxville, Tennessee. So tomorrow is my practice run through. Come out, support, give me feedback so that I can win the competition next month. And then finally, in June and July, as part of Disciples of Christ denomination, they're sending 2 seminarians abroad, one to Philippines and one to Pakistan, and I've been selected to go to Pakistan. So I'll be working with women. I'll be working with women and children, refugees of climate change in Pakistan, and I was really looking forward to it, just to meet all sorts of different folks from all over the world, but with USAID cuts, I might be one of the only Americans. So it might be me with some German, French, Norwegian, etc. Working to find solutions. It'll be at an NGO level, which will help with my safety and ability to get out of the country should our administration tweet something that gets us into a war. So thank you for coming. This lecture, it's actually 3 parts. We're just going to do part 1 today and focus on significant Christian women of history. This is not biblical women. This is women, as soon as Jesus died, how did the women of the Roman Empire respond? How did the church expand in those early days of the church? We typically hear a lot more about medieval women, Joan of Arc, Hildegard, etc. But this whole argument is to show us that women have always been a key part in leading and founding churches up until that power was removed from them. And we're going to find out how. So, this also was part of, I did a semester on this, so I'll be condensing a few weeks of my semester into 45 minutes for y'all. And again, we're going to go over Christian women of Roman Empire history, not biblical history. Give me a second here. So, come on. Okay. Okay. So why does this matter? Sorry, I'm running 2 different things right now. For thousands of years, women's voices have been silenced, erased, forgotten, in favor of those who hold the pen, those who have the right and privilege to literacy, education, power, status, wealth accumulation. However, as this presentation will show us all today, it was women who were primarily responsible for spreading the word of Jesus, for using their wealth to finance churches, early churches, monasteries, donating a lot of their land and estates to the Christian movement. And then, of course, those who weren't donating land were donating or giving their lives as nuns, as, that's a big one, nuns, deaconesses, ministers, etc. So, goodness. Okay. We'll see also how women's scholarship, there were women that were learning to read, write, hold estates, hold some sort of power and privilege within the Roman Empire. They did not become Caesar, but they were able, through private tutors, to learn how to read and write, and that played a huge difference in a lot of women working for some of the male early theologians and male leaders, Christian leaders. St. Augustine, Marcion, Paul. We'll talk about Paul and the women that he worked with. And as I mentioned, this is there's a few parts to this lecture. We'll just do part one, but I want to thank Dr. Wong, who is my feminist theologian teacher down at my seminary, Phillips Theological Seminary. She was the one that introduced me to this subject. So there are currently 450 versions of the Bible just in English. The main ones we know about are the NRSV, the Newly Revised International Version, the King James Version, the ESV. Those are some of our bigger ones. And what's interesting about these specifically was because the New Testament was written in Koine Greek and then translated, and so we wind up having translations of translations, and it becomes a game of telephone. These translations have had massive impacts on women, queer, people of color, slavery, environment, and a big task actually for us in seminary is that we do take Greek and Hebrew so that we can translate it and read it for ourselves. We'll start with Paul in Romans 16. Now I'm not going to read to you this whole verse, but mainly it's a roster. And it starts with Paul writing to the Romans, the Roman congregation, which he had not met yet. He did not found the Roman church. He simply knew it was a very large congregation that was forming across the Mediterranean and was hoping to get there because he was over in Turkey, Anatolia at the time. And he sends Phoebe, in which he says, the very first line, "I commend you to our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord, as is fitting for the saints," etc. And then he goes on to greet many people, Epaenetus, Mary, Andronicus, and Junia, but it's a lot of men and women that Paul is greeting in this letter. And you might think, why does that make a difference? Because Paul is literally sending a woman to communicate this incredible message to a church he's never met before, a community he did not found, and he sends Phoebe. Call her your sister under Christ, a deacon of the church. Now this is really important because, as I mentioned with translations, in the King James Version and the ESV, which is what a lot more conservative evangelical churches use, whenever the word diakonos is used, they use it to say servant or minister, mainly minister. However, when it's used after a woman, it becomes servant or helper. So really, we see the same Greek word being translated differently depending on if it's being used to attribute to a man or to a woman. And based on the rest of that Romans 16, Phoebe has status. Phoebe has power. He is introducing her as someone that can be trusted, as someone who is a sister and equal, as someone who is a leader. And in the past century, a lot of translators have come back and said, wait a minute, we shouldn't be changing the definition or translation of this word just because it follows a woman. So it's the same word. If it follows a man, typically gets translated to minister or deacon, and then if it gets after a woman, it was default translated to be a servant or a helper. And so a lot of more progressive theologians have come back and said, no, Phoebe has way too much power and status to be considered just a servant or a helper. So we'll go and I want to touch, of course, on the women of Jesus. We're not going to go too much into the biblical women, but just a refresher. Virgin Mary, of course, Mary Magdalene, Mary and Martha, And then there's Thecla, from the Acts of Paul and Thecla. There are many more women in the New Testament and throughout the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, whatever is your language for it. But in any of these situations in which Jesus is speaking with these women, he does not speak to them in any sort of condescending tone. Doesn't change his language or the way he sees them just because of their gender, which is very pronounced when you consider, if you move over and start looking at some of what Paul has to say, he does start changing how women should be treated based on their gender. So, again, looking more at Jesus and what does Jesus approach women versus apostles of the time or disciples of the time using their own social status when they write these documents and letters. So there is a story in Luke, which we talked about today in the service, not this story, about Jesus and the Virgin Mary, in which Jesus was saying these things. A woman in the crowd called out, "Blessed is the mother who gave you birth and nursed you." Blessings to your mom. Good, thank you. God bless your mom. And Jesus replied, "Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it." Basically, he was emphasizing less on his mother's role of birthing him, which of course is important, but also being like, and thank God she supported me. Thank God that she's here, that she was the one to teach me everything that I know now, so that I could come to you. So he's really emphasizing her role as a teacher of God, a teacher of values. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Jesus doesn't change his message or tone or demeanor when he's speaking to women versus men. So Jesus dies, goes on the cross, dies, and is resurrected. And this sends shockwaves throughout the Roman Empire. You have to imagine at the time, the Roman Empire was vast. It cost a lot of lands, going as far as Spain to almost India. And there were trade routes and Christians in China. Like, it was a massive deal for its time, especially when we consider that this man, Jesus, this carpenter, this lowly man, stood up against the Roman Senate and died for it. That was a really big deal at the time, and it still is today. And early Christians really prioritized helping the poor, helping the needy, helping the least of these. And so as the church was gaining popularity, it was wealthy Roman women who wanted to be a part of this, who acknowledged what was going on within the Christian faith. And we'll talk about these 5 women in particular. 5, yes. Some of them you may have heard of. I know that you'll have a Lydia group, so this might be a refresher. But a big part of Roman culture was this idea of patrons, where wealthy people would somehow adopt lower economic folks and fund them through school, through skills training, perhaps with their housing or medical. And it was a sort of status to be a wealthy person with a lot of people that you patronize. So yet was seen as a sort of philanthropy at its time. How many people were you funding? How many families, etc.? Because the more you had, it meant the more money you had. So Lydia at Philippi, which was a Roman colony, she was a merchant who sold purple dyes or purple clothing, textiles, but the point was that she used, that was her hallmark. You see a lot of artwork with Lydia wearing purple. That's because that was her job. That's how she gained income. And that's how she made her money. She was a patron. And through serving and benefiting, funding the lower economic classes, she was introduced to Christianity. She was really impressed with what it was all about. She liked the idea of people having equal status, of people helping those who are less fortunate, of seeing the Roman government as just a form of government, not the end-all be-all, because we have to remember that the Roman government was also intertwined with religion, that empires and leaders at the time were considered deities. And so this idea that your local senator or your regional senator, your emperor, was not a god, that they were just a leader, really behooved her. Um, so she invested a lot of her wealth into building the first church in Philippi, and spreading the gospel. So here she is, a woman of wealthier status, meaning that her family probably afforded her the ability to have a private tutor. She knew how to read, how to write. She had money from her job, not her job, but from her business, and she turned around and filmed that right into the early church and spreading the message of the gospel. This is our first instance of a wealthy female investor of Christianity, and she was the first documented convert outside of the Middle Eastern area. Then we jump right into the other women. We have Marcella. She was a widow and orphan. She had access to wealth through her parents' death. They had a large, wealthy estate, and she turned her estate into a monastery. So she could have kept it in the family. She could have, and again, a lot of these estates, this aristocracy, it was very much kind of like how it is today, kept in the family. So this is a generational estate, and she decided to give that back to the church for monastery purposes, to training and educating future leaders and spreaders, evangelicals of the Christian church. We also have Paula, a wealthy widow, who studied Greek and Hebrew, again having access to a private tutor. She followed Jerome, if you're familiar with Jerome, an early theologian, and she established monasteries in the Holy Land. So she has this money and lives off of her money to further her education, her exposure, her pilgrimage, and then comes back and helps her local community understand that too. And then we have Melania the Elder, which is the grandmother to Melania the Younger, and they were a lineage of very wealthy senators for generations of aristocracy, very wealthy money, and she founded monasteries, Melania the Elder, all over. She could not get rid of her money. She had so much money that it was a problem actually for both Melania the Elder and Melania the Younger. They had so much money they couldn't get rid of it. They built multiple monasteries, donated lots of land back to the church, lots of churches were built, orphanages or some type of orphanages and welfare. So we see like these women catching early on, they're very wealthy, and a lot of that's probably because as wealthy as they were, as privileged as they were still women in a patriarchal system. They couldn't speak out. They had to leave the room when their husbands came home for business. They understood that being close to power also meant that you were the first ones to be exempt from power. So they understood what privilege meant with all their wealth, but also that they weren't the most privileged. And that sense of empathy can do a lot when we talk about compassion. Then her granddaughter, Melania the Younger, very similar to Paula and her grandmother, used her money to found monasteries, go on large, extravagant Holy Land pilgrimages. And Melania the Younger, especially, as we mentioned, couldn't give away her money. I mean, she, even like as she was dying, still had a lot of money that she was just trying to give away. She almost had a lot of self-loathing and self-hate for being as wealthy as she was. And she was friends with St. Augustine. She was able to write and communicate with him, talking about the ascetic lifestyle, of this minimalist lifestyle of having too much and giving it all back to community. We do see that a lot in early Christian history, this sort of martyr of all things. Come on. Okay. Here we're going in the apostolic women, the martyrs and the deaconesses. Women died. Women have always died at the hands of the church, whether it's these women or the Scottish witch hunts or because of laws passed based on Christian values that harm women's health care. So we have Blandina, Perpetua, and Felicitas, and Thecla, and then we'll get into the apostles, these early women that spread the news of Jesus, and then deaconesses, those who led churches. Now Blandina led a group of martyrs. She was arrested. She withstood torture, really horrible, graphic torture, to the point where the guards were, I wouldn't say impressed, but they had tortured her so badly, and she was still so devout in her faith and kept standing up or kept, getting back up, that even the guards amongst them said that she must be tapped into something larger, because no human should be able to withstand what she has. They hung her on a stake in the arena, but her body was hung in such a way that it resembled the cross, that it resembled just like Jesus. And as she was dying on this stake, on this structure in the arena with other martyrs who were being killed and tortured and fought, there's groups, fanfare all around the stadium, the arena. She's praying very loudly, and her fellow martyrs are very inspired by that. Here she is, she's bleeding out, she's beat up, she's bruised, she's burned, she's cut, and here she is in this Christ-like pose, praying all the way until her last breath. And it was just this inspirational experience for all who attended. We have Perpetua and Felicitas. Perpetua is a wealthy convert. She found Christianity, and she was a nursing mother. And Felicitas was her pregnant slave. They were arrested for their Christian beliefs very early on. Perpetua was able to keep her baby in prison with her. And as she's nursing, she's like thinking and relating to the Virgin Mary this entire time, what it would be like to love your child, to do whatever for your child. And at the same time, Felicitas gives birth like a day or two before they are to enter the arena to be tortured and killed in front of a bunch of fans. So they're both relating this suffering to motherhood and birth, to the suffering of Jesus. Felicitas actually, she gives birth in the jail cell with Roman guards, and has this whole very deeply spiritual experience of her almost like birthing this new version of herself. Felicitas did die in the arena, unfortunately, but she saw, as I said, the spiritual experience. She told her slave owner, Perpetua, that she saw this dying in the arena as a form of baptism. Like, I've given birth, here's this new child, this new world we're trying to build, and if I die, I know that I will be with my Lord. And Thecla, where are we? She was engaged and broke off her engagement. She did not want to aspire to be a homemaker. She wanted to be out. She did not particularly like her fiance. It was an arranged marriage of sorts, and she becomes completely celibate. She follows Apostle Paul and gets harassed by noblemen who come to watch her speak, watch her journey with Paul, and she rejects them, and Paul defends her. So we see now Paul is also defending the women. That's why we have evidence of the diakonos translation, as I mentioned earlier. She was sentenced to death in the arena, the Roman arena, with beasts, lions, big cats, bears, etc. And not a single beast touched her. So she proclaimed God was her protector, and the governor and all the noblemen who watched and looked on were afraid. So this is now, we're seeing more women are being thrown in the arena. They're being used as examples. They're being tortured, killed because of their Christian beliefs. And the more women that are doing this, it's actually becoming a movement because people are getting angry to see such women, vulnerable women, be thrown and be tortured, and especially that in which no animal hurt her, no animal touched her. This is where the powers that be were like, are we actually making an example of them, or are we just inadvertently starting a movement that we're not trying to start? Because a lot of people were getting impressed and inspired by these women. And then, of course, we have our apostles. Mary Magdalene. She was the first female patient, as we can call it, turned follower. She was prominently at the crucifixion. We have multiple biblical texts that put her there, and the resurrection. She was one of the women at the tomb. We can do a whole presentation on Mary Magdalene, but what's important is that we have the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, and then how quickly Jesus' sense of equality, respect, and love was able to be understood by the women that he followed, that he healed. Junia worked with Andronicus in preaching, and it was possible, we don't know for sure, that she met Jesus or followed Jesus, but we think that she might have, and she was one of the women that I mentioned way earlier on with the letter about Phoebe. But Paul really appreciated Junia and Andronicus because they did live during the time of Jesus and were in the cosmopolitans, and Paul didn't. Paul did not meet Jesus, so he really appreciated working with her. And then from the Gospel of Luke, we have Anna. She was a widow who did not leave the temple after her husband's death, and when Jesus was born, she actually blessed him. She was at the temple. So she told people that Jesus was the chosen one. So we have the Virgin Mary, and then we have Anna who blesses him, that understands that this baby is special, that he's chosen. And we have Dorcas and Priscilla. Dorcas was an elderly widow who started an order of widows. Again, there was no welfare from the Roman Senate. There was no, your husband died, that was the end of it. And there wasn't savings, it was hard to control the estate. There was just not a lot of opportunities for women to be solid or okay or stable or safe if their husband or father died. And Dorcas responded by starting an order of widows to help protect other women whose husbands died of whatever. And then, of course, distributed welfare to the needy. And then finally we have Priscilla. She was Jewish. She married Aquila, yes. And she did follow Jesus. Then the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews in AD 49. Claudius was crazy. He was a narcissistic emperor and went on a spree trying to get Christianity as the popular church, and expelled a lot of Jews. So she moved with Aquila to Achaia, however you want to pronounce that, to Corinth to start a church, and that is where Paul met Priscilla. And then we have our deaconesses. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it didn't slide. Okay. We have our deaconesses, Phoebe, as mentioned earlier, exalted, asked by Paul in the letter to the Romans, like, please welcome her as a sister, welcome her as an equal. She is a servant of the church, a diakonos, a minister, a deacon. And then we have Olympias. Her husband died, and she refused to remarry. She started a monastery next to Hagia Sophia. Does anyone know how to pronounce that? Hagia Sophia, and a bishop ordained her. So now we see that Paul has ordained, kind of implies that there's a formal process. So we can't really say that Paul ordained Phoebe, except that he just gave her authority. But here with Olympias, about a century later, there are policies and procedures at this point. She's getting ordained. So now we're seeing that the institution is recognizing women. Her two sisters were also ordained, and her female cousin. She was friends with John Chrysostom, which is another theologian. So yes, as mentioned, we have wealthy women at the top level, quote unquote, of society that are funding these churches and monasteries. We have women that followed Jesus that were probably more middle or lower class. And then we're seeing that women are gaining power in the church, being ordained, having official leadership, institutional roles. And And all of that was moving along until this increase of wealth and power and status, the popularity of Christianity really started to threaten Rome. It created a danger for women. A lot of these Roman men did not like that these women were able to lead orders of women, that they had status as they walked around the street, that people liked them, they shook their hands, they donated money to their causes. And again, if we think about why Jesus died, he died protesting the state, and for a lot of reasons. But so we have these women gaining status in a context that was a protest to the Roman government. And then as these Roman wealthy elite women and other women embarked on this idea of love, empowerment, of leadership, they also started to look at marriage a bit differently, childbirth a bit differently, the emptiness of wealth a bit differently. And they started to wonder, is there something more to life? So while we have these women that are celibate by choice, or they remain unmarried, and then women going out into the desert. They were inspired by Jesus spending 40 days in the desert. They wanted that sort of connection to nature, the lack of societal pressures to become a wife or a mother, etc. And a lot of them, many women, left Rome and the major metropolitans altogether to go live in the desert. And they lived in caves or dwellings, they lived in communities, and they just kind of started their own societies away from the wealth and the hustle and bustle of the city. They have reports of wealthy women being a part of these communities, women that were affected by sexual assault or just harassment, and then many were queer or asexual and didn't want the expected societal pressures. So they got out of the city and went into the desert. We know all of this because of archaeological findings in caves, in dwellings out in the caves around the Middle East, around Greece and Italy, as well as Turkey. We also know from early texts about the diakonos, which is what I was mentioning earlier, the deacon women, that there were plenty of women that had status as this diakonos. And even going into the 300s and 400s, we have major theologians like Clement of Alexandria affirming women deacons, affirming that women had leadership authority and privileges. And then right around the 4th century, the 300s and 400s, is when we see the fall of leading women. So the church is growing in popularity, status, money, wealth, influence, and by 396, male deacons and preachers claimed that these women were tempting them, right? They're the temptresses. Their sex was too weak to preach from the pulpit about God, and they ordered their removal. And then by 541, we still have these documents, continued text, about the banishment of women ordination, meaning that as early as 396, 300s, men were complaining, men of status and power were complaining about women being these temptresses and that they were too weak to preach. But yet, almost 50 years later, there were churches and communities that were still doing it. And that's why we see these documents telling organizations, congregations to stop, because they didn't want to. They wanted their local women, or they wanted their communities to be able to dictate who would be their leader. And then, we had popes that came out supporting women ordination. So it was very much controversial even in the first 300 years, 400, 500 years. And we gotta remember, the United States is still less than 300 years old. So we're covering a lot of time right now between the resurrection, and who has the authority and privilege of being able to speak on God's word. And it really ultimately ended by the 12th century. So, as mentioned, we don't know a lot about all of this, or I guess the population, however you want to say it. We know St. Augustine, we know about Paul, we know about Nero, or Martin Luther, King Henry VIII. We know these names, but it's always women's voices that have been historically erased, silenced, forgotten. And which is interesting because every single one of those men that I just mentioned all had mothers, right? Or they wouldn't be here. And so acknowledging the women's role in spreading the church, the women's role, whether it's a mother of a theologian, a wealthy woman who was able to fund land and welfare, reading and writing, etc. They've been a pivotal, critical part of Christianity's spread. And also, interestingly enough, they constitute the majority of church congregations. So, which is its own thing. That churches are predominantly made up of women, but it's the men that lead. So the early Christian women made notable contributions to Christian history since the time of Jesus until now. They always have, but yet they have been largely forgotten, ignored, or silenced. And I hope that this presentation offers to shed a bit more light on the women and what they have done in the early Christian church. That's my citations. So, thank you. Any questions or?
When you talked about the different versions of the Bibles, which is the progressive one?
So probably the NRSV. That's one that the progressives churches typically use. NIV is used a lot, but typically we see the NRSV, and then there's another NRSV UE.
Updated edition.
Yes, updated edition. So it keeps going. But yeah, I thought it was funny as I was looking into it. There is one called, what is it called? Is it the Sinner's Bible? But in the translation, came out right before King James Version. By Wycliffe, who translated for the English, and but there was a version where it says, "Thou shalt not covet your wife," or another person's wife, and they left out the "not" accidentally, and they published it. They didn't catch it till later, so they call it the Sinner's Version. Like they're like, "Ooh, you should definitely not covet not." So, but yeah, there's a lot out there.
Did you talk about a version that was E something?
There's ESV.
ESV, which one? What does that stand for?
English Standard?
Yeah, English Standard.
Is this the dumbed down one?
Well,
There's a
it depends
dumbed
on,
down
I
one.
mean, I would say the most, I don't know if that's appropriate term, but the most dumbed down one would be the Message, which is
Oh, maybe
completely
after the Message.
paraphrased.
Right,
Yes.
that's a paraphrase, so not translation.
I think the ESV is an actual translation, but it's more how we would typically speak and
Oh,
not,
okay.
it's further away from
King James.
King James, for sure.
Yeah,
I like the Message even though.
I do too. Message is great for
I
like a
love
Bible
it.
study.
I definitely, it's one on my list as I'm reading. I read multiple translations just because sometimes a word in one will stick different. I mean, this week I read 900 because there were only 3 verses. Kidding.
There's one, the Living Letters too, or something, that's paraphrased as well.
Is that the New Living Translation? Or you said Living Letters or something like that?
Well, that's part of the Living Bible. There is,
The
the
Living,
whole
yeah.
Bible was paraphrased as Living Bible. And then the letters are also sometimes publish separately living letters.
Oh, I see. That's
So this
what
is
I
the
meant.
letters of the New
This is
Testament,
that portion of the
of the
living
New
Bible.
Testament, yeah.
And that's paraphrased as well, right?
That's paraphrased, yeah.
And some staunch Christians will tell you that paraphrases are not okay. I will tell you, anything you're reading that, I mean, any translation or version that allows you to read the Bible and want to read the Bible is A-okay.
Yeah, I can't imagine, like, they'll say to a new convert or somebody who's interested, is to read and usually it's the King James Version of the Bible. Who can get anything out of that, really, honestly?
Yeah, and I think there is,
It's really hard to understand, or especially with all the background that goes into it, and so much of it is misused.
yeah, and,
Right.
Understatement, but yeah.
and a thing about the King James Version too, like the history of it, for those who may not know, it came out right after the split, the Protestant Reformation, and King James didn't really want to change the Bible, didn't want to change Christianity, he just wanted control over it. So he stamps his name on the Bible, and at the same time he's stamping his name on this Bible saying like, oh no, we don't answer to the Catholics down in Rome, now I oversee it in this godly state. He passes the sodomy, he bans sodomy and homosexuality, he starts burning women on the stake, and he launches a state-funded, if you will, literacy program for the Scottish schools to walk away from pagan faiths and to learn the Bible at schools with his name on it. Sound familiar?
Huh,
So, anyway.
we've come full circle.
Yes.
When the Bible, when